In 1356, the Ming Dynasty printed so much paper money that a single bolt of silk, something you could carry under your arm, cost more banknotes than a person could physically hold in both hands. 20 years earlier, that same currency had funded the largest maritime expeditions in human history. What breaks isn't always the system itself. It's the belief that the system still works. The illusion of stability. For nearly 2 centuries, the Song dynasty operated what historians now recognize as the world's first large-scale paper currency system. Between 960 and 1127 CE, China's economy expanded at a rate that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Merchants moved goods across thousands of miles without transporting a single coin. Tax revenues multiplied. Trade flourished. The paper itself had no intrinsic value. It was simply a premissa claim on future goods, backed by imperial authority and the collective agreement that these slips of printed mulberry bark represented something real. And for generations they did. The currency worked because people believed it would work tomorrow. That belief created the conditions for unprecedented economic growth. Growth reinforced belief. The cycle appeared self-sustaining. But the same mechanism that enabled expansion also concealed a structural vulnerability, one that would resurface with remarkable consistency in every subsequent attempt to build monetary power on confidence alone. Origins. The story begins not with policy, but with geography. During the Tang dynasty, copper coins dominated China's monetary system, but copper was heavy. A merchant traveling from the interior to coastal trade ports might need to transport thousands of coins, literal tons of metal, to conduct business. Bandits, rough terrain, and sheer physical logistics made long-distance commerce cumbersome and dangerous. In Sichuan province, merchants developed a practical solution. They would deposit their coins with trusted brokers who issued paper receipts. These receipts could be exchanged for goods or redeemed for copper at a later date. The system worked because the brokers maintained reserves and operated within small, tight-knit communities where reputation mattered. When the Song dynasty came to power in 960 CE, the government recognized an opportunity. If paper certificates could facilitate trade in one province, they could do so across the empire. The state began issuing its own notes, initially backed by deposits of copper and silver. This was not merely an administrative convenience, it was a tool of centralization, a way to unify disparate regional economies under a single monetary authority. The early Song notes were conservative by design. They circulated in limited regions. They expired after a set period, forcing holders to exchange them for new notes and preventing indefinite accumulation. And critically, they were partially backed by metal reserves held in government treasuries. The system succeeded because it solved a genuine problem. It reduced transaction costs, enabled long-distance trade, and allowed the government to collect taxes more efficiently. For decades, the currency held its value. People accepted it not because they were forced to, but because it made their lives easier. The rise. By the mid-11th century, paper money had become the standard medium of exchange across much of China. The economy responded. Agricultural output increased. Urbanization accelerated. Cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou grew into metropolises with populations exceeding 1 million, larger than any European city of the era. The government discovered something powerful. It could issue currency without immediately depleting its metal reserves. As long as only a fraction of noteholders demanded redemption at any given time, the system remained stable. The state could print more notes than it had metal to back them. This worked because of confidence. Merchants, farmers, and officials all believed the notes would retain value. That belief was self-fulfilling. As long as everyone accepted the currency, it functioned as money. The Song government used this flexibility to finance ambitious projects. It funded infrastructure, supported standing armies on the northern border, and subsidized industrial production. The economy grew. Tax revenues increased. The currency system appeared to vindicate itself, but the expansion also created dependence. Government budgets assumed continued access to this new source of funding. Military expenditures rose. Administrative costs expanded. The state began to rely not just on the currency system, but on its ability to issue currency in amounts that exceeded its reserves. No one called this a problem. Growth was real. Trade was thriving. The currency was accepted everywhere. Why would anyone question it? Historical case study number 1. The Song collapse. The crisis began quietly, in the form of a war the Song dynasty could not afford to lose. In 1125, Jurchen invaders from the north breached the empire's defenses. The government needed funds immediately. It did what seemed logical. It printed money. Large amounts of money. The printing presses ran continuously. New notes flooded the economy to pay soldiers, purchase supplies, and fund the war effort. At first, this appeared to work. Armies were fed. Defenses were reinforced. The currency still circulated. But something had changed beneath the surface. The ratio of paper notes to metal reserves had shifted dramatically. There were now far more claims on goods than there were goods available. Merchants began to notice. The prices of rice, silk, and basic commodities started to rise. Not suddenly. Gradually, by 1127, the Song capital had fallen. The government fled south and established a new capital in The Southern Song dynasty continued to print currency, now with even less territorial control and fewer resources to back it. The notes still bore imperial seals. They still carried official declarations of value, but fewer people believed them. Merchants began demanding payment in silver or goods rather than paper. Those forced to accept the currency spent it immediately, knowing it might be worth less tomorrow. This accelerated the loss of value. As confidence eroded, the currency system didn't collapse in a single catastrophic event. It dissolved through 1,000 individual decisions to avoid holding paper. By the mid-12th century, entire regions had reverted to barter or local scrip. The Song government continued to issue currency, but it circulated primarily among those who had no choice: soldiers, low-level officials, those dependent on state payments. The sophisticated monetary system that had enabled 2 centuries of growth had fractured into a patchwork of competing local currencies and metal-based trade. The economy didn't stop, it adapted. But the scale and efficiency of commerce contracted dramatically. Long-distance trade became more difficult. Tax collection became less reliable. The government's ability to fund large-scale projects diminished. What had broken wasn't just paper. It was the collective agreement that the paper represented something stable. Historical case study number 2. The Yuan and Ming experience. The Mongol Yuan dynasty, which conquered China in 1279, inherited a profound lesson about paper currency. They chose to ignore it. Kublai Khan, impressed by the administrative efficiency of paper money, mandated its use throughout the empire. His early issues were relatively conservative, backed by silver reserves and accepted in exchange for taxes. The system worked. Marco Polo, visiting China in the 1270s, marveled at how paper money circulated across vast distances, accepted everywhere without question. But the Yuan government faced the same temptation the Song had encountered. Wars on the frontier required funding. Administrative expansion demanded resources. The printing presses offered an apparently simple solution. By the early 14th century, the Yuan had printed so much currency that prices had increased more than tenfold. A pound of rice that once cost a few notes now required a thick stack. Merchants began refusing payment in paper. The government responded by making refusal illegal, punishable by death. This didn't restore confidence. It destroyed what remained. When law must compel people to accept a currency, the currency has already failed as a medium of voluntary exchange. The yuan continued printing, and the economy fragmented. Black markets using silver and barter proliferated. Official commerce became a theater where people went through the motions while conducting real transactions elsewhere. The Ming Dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols in 1368, was determined to avoid the same mistake. The early Ming emperors issued paper currency backed by strict limits on printing and severe penalties for counterfeiting. The system worked initially, then came the same pattern. Military campaigns against Mongol remnants in the north required funding. The court printed money. Prices rose. Merchants grew skeptical. By 1450, the Ming paper currency had lost more than 90% of its value compared to a century earlier. By 1500, it had effectively ceased to circulate in most regions. China returned to a silver-based monetary system, one that would persist for the next 4 centuries. Paper money, the innovation that had once made China the most economically advanced civilization on earth, became something to avoid, a cautionary tale rather than a tool of progress. Breaking point. The breaking point in these systems never arrives with dramatic announcement. There is no moment when a government declares its currency worthless or people wake up to find their money void. Instead, confidence fails in stages. First comes doubt among the most sophisticated participants, merchants engaged in long-distance trade, money changers, those with the means to choose how they hold wealth. They begin to prefer alternatives. They don't refuse the currency outright. They simply try to hold less of it. Second, this preference spreads. What begins as prudence among the wealthy becomes common practice among the middle class. Shopkeepers accept payment but immediately exchange it for goods or metal. Wages are spent the day they're received. Third, the velocity of money increases. Currency circulates faster because no one wants to hold it. This acceleration itself drives prices higher, which reinforces the desire to spend quickly. The currency becomes hot to the touch. Fourth, those without options, the poorest, those paid in fixed wages, those dependent on the state bear the full weight of devaluation. They cannot avoid the currency. They watch their purchasing power evaporate, while those with resources have already moved to safety. Finally, the government faces a choice: stop printing and accept immediate fiscal collapse, or continue printing and watch monetary collapse accelerate. Both options are ruinous by this point. The decision becomes not whether to crash, but how to manage the descent. In the Song, Yuan, and Ming cases, governments chose to keep printing. The alternative, defaulting on obligations to soldiers, officials, and creditors, threatened immediate political collapse. The monetary destruction was slower, more diffuse. It could be blamed on merchants, foreigners, or economic conditions rather than policy. This is the pattern. The breaking point occurs long before anyone acknowledges it publicly. Fallout. The economic consequences of monetary collapse extend far beyond mere inconvenience. When the Song currency system fragmented, trade networks that had taken generations to build dissolved. Merchants who had specialized in long-distance commerce found their business models unworkable. Cities that had grown wealthy as trading hubs contracted. Artisans who had produced goods for distant markets lost their customer base. The government's fiscal capacity diminished severely. Unable to collect reliable taxes or fund operations through currency issuance, the state resorted to requisitioning goods directly, demanding payment in rice, silk, or labor rather than money. This was far less efficient and far more coercive. Investment in infrastructure ceased. The canal systems, roads, and ports that had facilitated Song-era growth fell into disrepair. Without a stable monetary system, long-term economic planning became nearly impossible. Why would anyone invest in a project that would pay returns in a currency that might be worthless by the time it bore fruit? Perhaps most significantly, the institutional damage persisted across generations. After the Ming Dynasty abandoned paper currency in the late 15th century, Chinese governments remained deeply skeptical of fiat money for nearly 500 years. The memory of collapse passed down through family histories recorded in literature. Embedded in merchant culture created a lasting preference for metal-based money and extreme caution about anything backed purely by governmental promise. This conservatism may have prevented repeated monetary disasters. It also meant China didn't develop the financial institutions that would later enable European commercial expansion: central banks, sophisticated credit systems, tradable government debt. The regions that suffered least from the currency collapse paradoxically fell behind in developing the tools that would define modern finance. The fallout wasn't just economic, it was psychological. It changed how an entire civilization thought about money, value, and trust. Failed fixes: each dynasty that experienced currency collapse attempted reforms. These reforms followed predictable patterns. The first response was always punishment. Governments executed counterfeiters, fined merchants who refused the currency, and mandated acceptance through legal force. This never worked. You cannot compel confidence through violence. Fear may force people to accept currency in the moment, but it doesn't make them hold it or value it. The second approach was recalibration. Governments would issue new currency, often at a fixed exchange rate to the old currency, declaring the new notes more trustworthy. The Yuan tried this multiple times. Each new issue was initially accepted, then suffered the same fate as its predecessor once the government resumed printing to fund its expenditures. The third strategy was backing reforms. Governments promised that new currency would be backed by metal reserves or by specific commodities like salt or grain. These promises were sometimes sincere, but sincerity proved insufficient. When the next crisis arrived, and it always did, the temptation to print exceeded the commitment to maintain backing. The fourth tactic was partial retreat. Rather than abandon paper currency entirely, governments would restrict its use to certain regions or certain transactions while allowing metal to circulate elsewhere. This created two-tier monetary systems where paper money served as an inferior currency for those with no alternative. None of these approaches addressed the fundamental problem. Once confidence in a fiat currency system is destroyed, no technical adjustment can restore it. The issue is not mechanical. It's not about better paper, better seals, or better enforcement. It's about belief specifically. The belief that the institution issuing the currency will resist the temptation to debase it. That belief, once broken, cannot be repaired through policy. It requires time, institutional change, and often the complete replacement of the system itself. Transition to the present, the specific mechanisms differ, but the pattern persists. In the 1920s, Weimar Germany discovered that a government facing impossible debts could simply print money to pay them. The currency collapsed within months. The social and political consequences lasted decades. In the 1940s, China's nationalist government, fighting a civil war, printed currency at such a rate that prices doubled every few days. People stopped using money altogether. By 1949, the currency was worthless, and the government it represented had fallen. In the 1990s, Yugoslavia faced similar pressures during the breakup of its federation. The government printed dinars to fund operations. At the peak, inflation reached 313 million% in a single month. The currency became effectively unusable. In the 2000s, Zimbabwe's government printed money to maintain spending without corresponding economic production. A $100 trillion note became a symbol of monetary failure, denomination so large it testified to the collapse of the numerical system itself. Each case involved different political systems, different economic contexts, different immediate causes, but the mechanism of collapse remained consistent. Governments with access to printing presses facing immediate crises chose short-term survival over long-term monetary stability. The currency worked until enough people stopped believing it would. The contemporary global monetary system operates on similar principles, though with far greater complexity. Since 1971, major currencies have been fiat money-backed, not by metal or commodities, but by governmental authority and collective confidence. Central banks create money through digital entries rather than physical printing, but the fundamental dynamic remains. The supply of currency can expand without direct limitation from physical reserves. This system has enabled enormous economic growth and flexibility. It has allowed governments to respond to crises, smooth business cycles, and fund development at scales impossible under metal standards. It also contains the same structural vulnerability that destroyed the Song currency system. It depends entirely on confidence. Pattern recognition. The progression appears across centuries with striking consistency. Stage 1. Innovation. A new monetary system is introduced that solves genuine problems and enables economic expansion. Paper currency, unbacked fiat money. Digital central bank reserves. Each innovation increases efficiency and flexibility. Stage 2. Success. The system works. Commerce thrives. Governments fund ambitious projects. The economy grows. Success validates the innovation and builds confidence. Seeing the system's benefits, governments gradually expand its use. More currency is issued. Backing requirements are relaxed. The gap between money supply and underlying reserves grows. Stage 4. Crisis. An external shock war, economic downturn, political instability creates urgent need for government funding. The printing press offers immediate relief. Stage 5. Acceleration. The government prints money to address the crisis. This temporarily solves the immediate problem but increases the total currency supply. If the crisis persists, printing continues and accelerates. Stage 6. Recognition. Sophisticated economic actors notice the expanding supply and begin seeking alternatives. They don't announce this publicly. They simply adjust their behavior. Stage 7. Spread. The preference for alternatives spreads from the sophistication to the general population. Currency is spent quickly rather than saved. Velocity increases. Prices rise. Stage 8. Breakdown. The currency loses its primary function as a store of value, then as a unit of account, finally as a medium of exchange. The system fragments. Local alternatives emerge. Stage 9. Collapse. The currency becomes effectively worthless, at least in voluntary transactions. Stage 10. Legacy. The institutional and psychological aftermath persists, often for generations. Trust in fiat currency, in governmental monetary authority, and in financial institutions diminishes substantially. Not every fiat currency system completes this progression, but every system that has completed it has followed these stages in sequence. A psychological element, human behavior during monetary decline, follows patterns that seem almost neurological. The first phase is dismissal. When prices begin rising or currency values begin falling, the initial reaction is to attribute this to temporary factors, crop failures, trade disruptions, normal fluctuations. People assume stability is the default state and instability an aberration. The second phase is rationalization. As decline continues, people construct narratives that explain why this situation is different, why the old rules don't apply, why the apparent problem isn't really a problem. The economy is changing. New methods of production justify higher prices. The government has tools previous governments lacked. The third phase is normalization. People adjust their behavior to accommodate the declining currency while continuing to operate as if the system is fundamentally sound. They spend money faster, they negotiate wages more frequently, they hold more of their wealth in goods, but they don't abandon the currency entirely. Not yet. The fourth phase is bifurcation. Society splits between those with options and those without. Those who can shift to alternative stores of value do so. Those who cannot, the poor, the elderly, those on fixed incomes, continue to bear the full weight of devaluation while watching others escape. The fifth phase is recognition. Suddenly, what was gradual becomes obvious. The currency is failing. This recognition often comes late, after the majority of damage is done. People realize they should have acted sooner, but the decline was slow enough that each individual step seemed manageable. The final phase is adaptation. The currency system may persist officially, but people root around it. Black markets develop. Alternative currencies emerge. Economic activity continues, but through different channels. What's striking is the delay between the beginning of the problem and its widespread recognition. Humans are remarkably capable of operating within broken systems while maintaining the belief that the systems are basically intact. This cognitive dissonance allows monetary decay to proceed much further than rational analysis would suggest possible. The silent phase. The most dangerous period in any currency decline is not when it's failing obviously. It's when it's failing invisibly. During the century between the early Song monetary expansion and the beginning of recognizable crisis, everything appeared fine. Trade flourished. Cities grew. The economy expanded. Government revenues increased. By every visible metric, the system was succeeding, but the underlying ratio of currency to reserves was shifting. The implicit promise that the money represented that note holders could claim real goods of stable value was becoming harder to honor. Not impossible. Not yet, just harder. No one woke up on a particular morning to find this had changed. It changed slowly, through 1,000 small decisions to issue slightly more currency, to defer slightly more redemptions, to rely slightly more on the system's flexibility rather than its constraints. The silent phase is silent because nothing appears to be breaking. The system still functions. Currency still circulates. Prices are stable or rising slowly enough to attribute to growth rather than debasement. This is the phase in which correction is still possible. The imbalances are building, but they haven't yet metastasized into crisis. A government could tighten monetary policy, could rebuild reserves, could strengthen the relationship between currency supply and economic fundamentals. But the silent phase is also the phase in which correction seems unnecessary. Why implement painful reforms when everything appears to be working? Why constrain economic growth when the system seems capable of supporting expansion? The Song dynasty, during its peak, had no reason to believe its currency system was fragile. The Yuan dynasty, in its early decades, saw paper money as an administrative triumph. The Ming Dynasty, in its first century, considered its monetary system a solved problem. The silent phase ends not with a bang, but with the gradual realization that the ground has been eroding all along. By the time this becomes undeniable, the foundation has been hollowed out. The structure remains standing, but only until the next significant stress. Closing reflection in 1356, when a bolt of silk required more banknotes than a person could carry. The currency hadn't failed overnight. It had been failing for decades, slowly, quietly, in ways that were easy to dismiss or rationalize or defer. The people living through this didn't have the advantage of historical perspective. They couldn't see the pattern because they were inside it. Each year seemed like a variation of the last. Each crisis seemed unique. Each decision to expand the currency supply seemed justified by immediate circumstances. Only later, after the collapse was complete, did the pattern become visible. And by then a new generation had risen, ready to believe that this time would be different, that the old lessons didn't apply, that sophisticated modern systems had solved the problems that destroyed ancient ones. The cycle repeats not because people are foolish, but because the memory of collapse fades faster than the temptation that caused it. Every civilization that has built a monetary system on confidence alone has eventually faced the same question: when will we stop? The answer has always been, when we have no choice. The Song dynasty, at its height, commanded the most advanced economy on earth. Its currency system was a marvel of financial engineering. Its collapse was not inevitable because of some technical flaw in paper money. It collapsed because the institutions managing that money prioritized short-term needs over long-term stability, repeatedly, until the gap between promise and reality could no longer be ignored. The question is never whether a confidence-based currency can work. The Song proved it can. The question is whether the institutions managing it can maintain the discipline required to sustain confidence across decades, across crises, across the inevitable temptation to solve immediate problems by creating money. History suggests this is among the most difficult tasks any government can attempt, not because the economics are complex, but because the incentives are overwhelming. The printing press is always there. The crisis is always now. The consequences are always later, and later always arrives.